Video, and this one's all about recovery. This is not going to cover the entire section on recovery. It's going to have to come in two parts because there's some little intricate details about this section that I think are quite important moving forward to a SAC. I mean, your use and understanding as young athletes, and also moving into the exam at the end of the year. So it's all about recovery. For this part of the textbook, we're at page 174, and it's important to remember, like what I said in class the other day when we're back face to face, each of the three energy systems, whichever one becomes predominant throughout exercise, whether it be a 10-second or 20-second sprint, whether it be a 400 metre or a 1500 metre run, or whether it be a half marathon, whether it be swimming or high jump, or whatever the predominant exercise is that determines the predominant energy system, we have a likely cause of symptoms of fatigue. Within these causes, which I won't go over because you know in detail now, there's two different things that you need to remember. Number one, you are either building something up. It's the accumulation of ADP and P, or hydrogen ions, or lactic acid, or you are depleting something. You're losing your stores of ATP or phosphate, creatine, or glucose, glycogen, or it might be plasma and blood volume due to sweat loss, etc. So whatever it is, it's either building up or it's depleting. And in order to recover what has gone wrong, you either need to replace what's been lost or remove what's been built up. And it's as straightforward as recovery is. Recovery is all about trying to return to the pre-exercise conditions. So how was the body feeling? How was it generating its energy? How was it storing its fuels? How did the body feel pre-exercise? And if you can get the body back to that pre-exercise condition as quickly as possible, then what ends up happening is, if you're able to do that faster than another athlete, then you can go and complete your next exercise and training session and get more gains and benefits than that athlete who's still going through their recovery 1 or 2 days later. So the process of speeding up the recovery rate of an athlete or individual is why a lot of these techniques are taken so seriously, and the research has been put into making sure that they're effective. The first thing that we need to look at is an active recovery versus a cool down. Now, you guys might have heard both of these terms before, active recovery and cool down, and quite often coaches might actually use them in the wrong sense. What we need to think about is, if we go over to a graph that we've seen oh so many times, which some of us on the SAC forgot the shading. When we start exercise, we need to build our heart rate and respiratory rate, our cardiovascular and respiratory responses, until the point where we can hit the demands. When oxygen is meeting the demand, you are in steady state. When you're in steady state, the aerobic system is dominant, and we're not fatiguing as much through that buildup of lactic acid and depletion of phosphate, creatine, when we're relying on anaerobic energy sources. That oxygen deficit, that shaded area on the left-hand side of the initial part of the graph, that actually needs to be fixed up when we finish exercise. That's the point where the lactic acid is building up. That's the point where we're depleting phosphate, creatine. And when we finish exercise and our initial demand for oxygen and energy goes straight back down to resting conditions, the heart rate, respiratory rate that takes that excess time gives us excess oxygen consumption. That excess oxygen needs to balance out to here. So the first thing that we talk about is, if we can extend this graph out and get more oxygen in, then we will have less of the deficit to pay back when we return to resting conditions. That is a cool down. However, an active recovery is different. An active recovery is completed on your rest day from training. So we're getting closer to Unit 4. We're talking more about elite athletes now. We're talking about athletes who train on specific days of the week, they compete on specific days of the week, and they have rest days or days off. So the question is, on that rest day, should I rest and sit on the couch, or should I do an active recovery? The answer to that is, what feels better for the athlete? An athlete who's more well trained, an athlete who is ready to continue to move their body around and it feels good for them to stretch the muscles out a little bit, and it's not causing any harm to them, and active recovery is better on a day off. The AFL players will quite often go for a jog on their day off rather than sit on the couch because they don't want their muscles seizing up. But that jog can't be of high intensity and therefore cause more damages to the body, like the delayed onset muscle soreness from the previous video. So whatever feels better for the athlete will be of more benefit to that athlete. So people who are less trained, who are not used to a regular training regimen, they should have their rest days as a rest day. The athletes who are well trained, they should have active recovery days, which is low intensity, continual movement, stimulating that blood flow and muscle stretchature. Okay, now we move on to the next bit over here. And this is all about refueling. When we refuel, we need to replace any of the items within the body that were lost during exercise, and it depends on which energy system was dominant. However, the first one that we're going to talk about here is phosphate creatine. We know that phosphate creatine is dominant for roughly 10 seconds throughout very high intensity exercise like a 100-meter sprint. So if the 100-meter sprint actually goes for 100 meters or roughly 10 seconds worth sprinting, and we usually use that 100 meters as an estimation, even though we're not as fast as Usain Bolt. Once that race is completed and the phosphate creatine stores in the body are depleted, we need to give them time to replenish. Active movement is actually not giving them the best adequate time for phosphate and creatine to bond back together. So what we need to do here is a passive recovery. Passive recovery means no movement or very minimal movement. So when we do a passive recovery, up to 70% of the phosphate creatine stores in the muscles will be replenished within the first 30 seconds. So that means roughly, if you were able to run 100 meters in 10 seconds exactly, and all of those 10 seconds came from phosphate creatine stores, if you gave yourself 30 seconds rest and tried to do another one, the first 70 meters or 7 seconds would all be coming from phosphate creatine again, because those are the numbers that they're telling us are able to replenish so quickly within 30 seconds. However, if you want to get full 100% stores of your phosphate creatine system back, then you need passive rest for up to 10 minutes. And some athletes can do this quicker than others, but on average, it's about 10 minutes to get phosphate creatine stores back to their resting conditions. This all happens over in the liver, okay? And when over in the liver, we have amino acids. Amino acids have come from the red meats and the protein that we eat. The liver can actually produce phosphate creatine on its own. But the other thing that we can talk about here is creatine monohydrate supplements. That's a creatine shake. When people have had a creatine shake, they're actually giving their body a chance to have more creatine lying around so that if it can find a phosphate to bond to, there's a better chance of actually having creatine phosphate bond back together. So by somebody having a creatine shake, two things. Number one, they're going to have slightly larger stores of creatine phosphate in the first place, so it can take maybe 11 seconds. And also, when we do that first 30 seconds of rest, it might be 75% of creatine phosphates get put back together because there's more creatines lying around the place. So having creatine supplementation can help in the recovery process as well as slowing the need for the recovery process to actually happen. But it's also important to understand that amino acids part of it here, and that if the athlete is not consuming the right amount of protein, then the process of putting phosphate creatine back together will not be able to occur in the liver. So it will slow, and it will mean that the recovery process is slower. If you have a look over here at the textbook, it's got the duration and the muscle phosphagen restored, so phosphate creatine being placed back together. And as you can see, up to 10 minutes. But the only difference here is from 180 seconds, which is 3 minutes, to 10 minutes is a 2% difference, which is why if you give yourself a 3-minute rest in between exercise bouts, you should be able to nearly use all of your phosphate creatine stores again if you want to train that energy system. This diagram here is showing a creatine saturation. So lots of creatines around the place because this person has had creatine drinks. The last thing that we want to look at very quickly is what's written in this paragraph down here, and that is when there is a low pH, which means we've got a lot of hydrogen ions, which is that acid, so the body's going through acidosis, the whole process of the liver producing phosphate creatine will actually slow down dramatically. So what we need is a lot of oxygen so that we're not going through the acidosis so that the phosphate creatine can restore. So an athlete who has been using their anaerobic glycolysis system and has built up that lactic acid, in particular the hydrogen ions, will actually slow the recovery rates shown in this table over here and not have as great a replenishment of phosphate creatine. The next thing we're moving on to is actually refueling the carbohydrates. So the glycogen that's stored around the body, within the muscles and within the liver, and also the glucose that is floating around in the bloodstream that's for that quick release for glycolysis. Roughly what they say is that we need to actually replace, or we lose, 1 gram per minute in moderate exercise. But that's moderate exercise. The moment that we go up closer to a faster run or even a sprint, we're actually burning a lot more than 1 gram per minute. However, if we look at just going for a light jog and we say that we went for 1 hour, then we know that we've roughly lost 60 grams of the carbohydrates that we had pre-consumed and would need to replace them. This table here, which there's no point in me going through, it's very self-explanatory, talks about how much training is the athlete completing, whether it be 1 hour or an hour and a half most days, and how much carbohydrate should I consume on those days to ensure that I have replaced. And this is grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. So if somebody weighs 100 kilograms, then they would need to eat 500 to 700 grams of carbohydrates if they're running and exercising 60 to 90 minutes per day of low intensity. So you can read that table yourself and see how much carbohydrate should I replace. This is the more important table in my opinion. When should I replace it? If you consume the glycogen, high GI, which is that fast release, within 1 hour, 55% will be restored within 5 hours and up to 100% within a day. That's a fantastic recovery rate because quite often you're not going to be exercising multiple times a day. You need those stores for the next exercise session, which is likely tomorrow. If you have it after the 1 hour and between the 1 and 2 hour mark after exercise, you'll get 100% restored, but it can take between 2 days, 1 to 2 days. So it's an extra day of waiting before the next exercise bout. If you consume it 5 hours after, which sometimes can happen, if you exercise high intensity during lunchtime and don't eat that carbohydrate meal until the evening, it can take up to 5 days to restore to the glycogen levels inside the body. So there's some things that people can do that are written in this section down here. A couple of things like hypertonic sports drinks. If we have a look over here, there's some protein examples that we'll talk about momentarily, but the carbohydrate sports drinks. If you're just going to drink water, there's no carbohydrates in it. If you're going to drink hypotonic, then it's a very low amount of carbohydrate, less than what's in your bloodstream usually. Isotonic is very similar to what's inside the body. However, if you want quick replenishment of carbohydrates, hypertonic drinks, which is greater than 8%, closer to 10% of the carbohydrate content within a drink. So things like Gatorade, Powerade, etc. You do need to be careful though, because a lot of these drinks do have sugars in them, which make you thirsty and continue to drink more, and that can cause insulin imbalances in the body. Bananas are fantastic. They've got carbohydrates. They're not a huge solid, so they're easy to break down in the stomach. And they're also a good source of potassium, which we know from the previous video how important potassium is with breaking down of glycogen and transporting glucose. So hypertonic sports drinks are good to replace carbohydrates as well. The other thing that comes out of this paragraph here is how quickly you need to consume those glycogen and carbs, as it's said over here. The faster this happens, the better off it is because of the insulin that's inside the body. During exercise, muscles are more responsive to insulin, and insulin works with glucose and glycogen, so the breakdown process from the high GI happens quicker. So this only happens within 30 to 45 minutes of the exercise finishing. So to have that sports drink ready to go for the moment that exercise is finished, it's actually really setting us up for this fast restore and more energy the next day. High GI is important, as I said before, and it's important to also note that inside the body, the muscle glycogen will repair first and the liver glycogen will be repaired second. It talks as well over here about the benefits of consuming carbohydrates with proteins. And what we know about that is that if you consume proteins after exercise, we'll talk about what it does to the muscles, but most importantly, it actually helps keep that insulin resistance and floating around inside the body, sorry, not resistance, the insulin abilities for the carbohydrates to work better. It actually happens for longer. So the more protein that's being consumed and the faster it's being consumed within 30 to 45 minutes of the exercise finishing, the better off we're going to be with replacing the glucose and glycogen from carbohydrates in the body. So it's important to make sure that we consume 30 to 40 grams of protein very, very quickly after exercise. One of the things that we know about consuming proteins as well is that it's really important to repair and build muscle. So after an exercise bout, in particular resistance or weights training, the 30 to 40 grams must include this leucine. The leucine really helps with that amino acid and really helps with the muscle actually activating the protein that's being consumed for muscle repairs. So within the first 30 to 45 minutes, consuming 30 to 40 grams of protein is critical. However, if we continue to consume up to 48 hours after exercise more protein, then that really helps. One of the things it mentions here is the post-workout shakes, the protein shakes, which I know that everyone's probably seen, if not tried. So the red meats and everything, we know the processing, there's not going to be any hidden sugars, there's not going to be anything in those that could be harmful to you, whereas this might have a high sugar content, so be careful to read the label. But in its liquid form, it's easy to take in very quickly after exercise, and the other thing that it does is it helps hydrate you, which we've spoken about a little bit already. But I want to talk about hydration as it goes through this summary, and it says to not consume alcohol and real foods and everything that I've already alluded to. The rehydration has a calculation attached to it, and the calculation is quite simple. For every 100 grams lost of sweat fluid, 150 mils of fluid should be consumed. So if you lose 1 kilogram of body mass during exercise, then you need to actually make sure that you drink 1.5 litres of fluid. And that fluid is quite often just water, but it's important to note that when we were talking about sweat loss in the previous chapter, the electrolytes being lost have a major role in what the body is doing as well. So by making sure that we consume drinks that actually have electrolytes in them, like those hyper or hypotonic drinks that I mentioned earlier on that slide, it's pretty critical that they are being replaced as well as the magnesium, the potassium, the sodium, etc. So, carbs in fluids can help, protein in fluids can help, fluid replacement can help. All of these fluids need to be consumed as well within the first 2 hours of exercise completing in order for the body to be able to process itself for the rest of the day. So, while all of this replenishment is happening, whether it be through the carbs, the proteins, or the liquids with the electrolytes in them, it is really important that the athlete is going through a passive recovery at this time. Any sort of active recovery in the refueling process will actually continue to burn some of the fuels that you're replacing and will therefore need to be refueled again. So when we're talking about replacing anything that's been lost, the passive recovery is the better option, which is very low to no exercise requirement.